In this lesson, we will be building what are called for loops. For loops are another way to write iteration statements. In previous lessons, we talked about while loops. Let's build one now. First, I have a variable that is a counter. I will build a loop that will execute 10 times, each time displaying the value of my counter to the screen. I will write a while statement that says, while the condition my counter is less than 10. I will display the value of my counter to the screen. I will then increment my counter variable. Let's run this application and see what it does. As we can see, we have written 10 values to the screen, 0 through 9. The loop stopped when my counter equals 10. If we break down the code that we just wrote, you can see a few important parts. First, we declared a counter. This keeps track of how many times we've gone through the loop. We have a condition. While the condition is true, we continue executing the contents of the while loop. Finally, we have an increment statement. This value increments the counter, and eventually that counter will no longer meet the requirements of our condition. These three parts make up a for loop. A for loop is another way that we can write this statement that will save time in terms of development. Using these three parts, let's build a for loop that does the same thing. We want to write 10 values to the screen, my counter equals 0 through 9, and then stop. I will leave my comments in place because these comments represent pseudocode. Instead of using a while statement, we can use what's called a for statement. To write a for statement, write the word for and open a parenthesis. A for statement consists of three parts. First, we want to initialize a new variable. Int my counter equals 0. After you make this statement, place a semicolon and begin within the parentheses to start a second statement. The second statement in this line will be your condition. As in the while loop and in our pseudocode, we want to loop 10 times, and we're going to increment by 1. So our condition will be my counter is less than 10. Add another semicolon. The third part of a for loop is the increment statement. In this case, we are incrementing my counter by 1. So we will simply write my counter plus plus. Do not place a semicolon after the third statement. As in a while loop, type in an open and closing bracket. Let's look back at our pseudocode. Our first step was to declare the myCounter variable. We did that in the for loop declaration. Next, we wanted to loop 10 times. Through the condition myCounter is less than 10 and the increment, we fulfilled this requirement. Finally, we wanted to increment myCounter by 1. Again, through the third statement in the for loop declaration, we have done this. The only thing left to do is to display the value of myCounter to the screen. Just like before, we will do this within the block of the loop. As you can see, writing a for loop saves a number of lines and time compared to writing a while loop. Let's run this application. We achieved the same result. We have written 10 values to the screen, 0 through 9, incrementing by 1. Let's walk through this for loop again. We declared a myCounter variable. We set a condition to loop while myCounter is less than 10. We're incrementing myCounter by 1. Each time this loop runs, we write the value of myCounter to the screen. As you can see, for loops are simply another way of writing an iteration statement. Much like a while loop in the counter iteration statements, we are looking for a counter value that increments or decrements and meets a condition. While the condition is met, the loop continues. Once the condition is no longer met, the loop stops.